Thanks very much. And what I'm going to say basically dovetails perfectly. So, but I'm going to take it from a standpoint of looking at a project that we have taken on over the past year, and what we've learned in terms of policies, and also a little bit of, well, I guess learned through successes and learned through failures. And so, first, the makings of good policy. Perhaps the most important thing I've learned is policy is not well enough understood, I don't believe. It's not well documented. I do believe that every policy needs to be somewhat unique. It needs to fit the, the case to which it's being applied, but there really aren't good guidelines or overviews. Certainly within different industry groups, there are some, and we found some of that. But I think that perhaps there's room for some meta policy or policy about policy. Something that gives some guidelines or some roadmap to building good policy, because working with a team of students trying to do this, I found that to be very, very tough. But here are the things that I've concluded, and I concluded. This is, students did all the hard work in concluding this, but I got to kind of be along for the ride. But we found that every policy should have a specific purpose or objective. That creating policy for the sake of having policies is a huge error. And we saw a lot of that error. The students looked at actually many hundreds of different policies from many organizations, and we did not find a single organization that didn't have that to at least some extent. Meaningless policy that somehow just got boilerplated into their processes. Policy should be clearly written and easily understood. We found some organizations do real well at that, some organizations not so much. It should be as succinct as possible. If they're given a choice of verbose wording and succinct little bit of wording and maybe a graphic or a diagram, that the graphic diagram with a little bit of wording would be better. Based and rooted in appropriate legal regulatory guidelines or framework sets. That we found a number of policies were simply, there seemed to be no grounding for it, no basis for that drove the policy. And essentially every organization now has some kind of regulatory or legal framework that they need to follow. There's enough laws governing privacy and all the rest that everybody needs something that they're basically rooting their policies in. And then communicating the purpose and scope of the system. And this is where I really get into what we found a lot of in terms of policies in the study that students did, was a lot of policies that were lists of do's and don'ts. Maintaining system X, do these 50 things, or don't do these 20 things. And I don't think that's good policy. I think good policy is really communicating the purpose and scope of the system, making sure that people working on the system understand what they should be living up to. When this was implemented, what were the ideas behind it? As part of that, having specifics as needed as the activities of the system that are permissible within the policy. So if a email server was set up for one purpose and now you're looking at expanding that email server to do many other things, you should be able to see clearly that you crossed a line, that that wasn't initially designed for that, this policy wasn't set for that. So if you're adding something like that, you need to go back and redo that process. Defining system interfaces. So I think the policy has to define all system interfaces with specific language for any access granted. So, and I think that was mentioned this morning as well, that policy needs to, within the policy, you need to understand what is in the system and what should be protected, and what are the different levels of protection. And then all of the provide specific language where needed on operational requirements or constraints. So there's some amount of do's and don'ts I think are appropriate in a lot of policies. That if you're going to run a backup, it should probably say how to run that backup. If any of you have ever tried to recover a system where people didn't exercise backups and follow good routines, you find oftentimes you can't recreate a system. And even though you have 3 years of backups, not one single one of those is usable. So there's some things that need to be documented and made very routine and whatnot. So now down to what was done well and done poorly. First of all, the student data center here at Cal Poly is a data center that students run completely on their own. It runs production workloads. Currently has about 19 different applications that it runs. These are internet-facing applications, at least many of them are. And so it requires the students to run things carefully, but it also, the university has a oversight requirement to that. We don't want our Class B address being blackballed on the internet because we were doing something that we shouldn't have. And so basically this is what the students set out to do. This was their proposal. And the thing, I think that this was a huge win. The students absolutely zeroed in on the right type of frameworks and the right policy sets. Both the NIST Special Publication 800, specifically 853 they looked at, and they looked at ITIL, and they actually met up with some local companies that use ITIL and got a kind of very simple first layer of ITIL compliance that they built into it. So I think that was a huge win, done exactly right. Unfortunately, that was just about the only win we had in the whole policy generation process. So things that didn't go well. First, they created way too many policies. I advised the team, I thought that in 1 quarter, 10-week quarter, I thought they should set their sights on 3 policies. And we gave a list of things we're doing in the data center currently, and said, of those things that we're doing, write policy for at least 3 of them. And what I got was, this was just the general policies. If you go forward, you find the network security policy, the server security policies, and applications policy, and then old and retired policies. And so, I'll go through why these were problematic. First of all, under general policies, a lot of these policies are for systems we don't even have in the data center. We have an email policy here. We didn't have any email servers or email systems. You can't write a policy for something that you're not doing and not even sure if you'll ever do. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't, follow the philosophy of being succinct. It also, how do you write a policy if you don't know what data you have? The system doesn't exist. So there's no way to base that. And yet, the students, as they worked on this, felt compelled. And they said, we looked out and we found we really had to include this because we found all the policies out there included. And I mentioned, but we don't run an email server. And they said, well, actually we found at least a quarter of the organizations we looked at, they don't run email servers either, and they still have one. So, that's the wrong reason to put a policy in. Putting it in because most people's boilerplate has an email policy in it. And so, some of the things they did do very well, they had an ethics policy, that one's fantastic, extremely well written, so another real win, I think, for our project, and a security response policy. And that's something our students use very heavily right now to determine, am I responding appropriately to any kind of problems that come up. And some of these, I'm going to go through the router and switch, the infrastructure policy, the students did a great job on. I'm going to go all the way, though, to old and retired policies. And this is the one that I found most problematic, because I pushed back with the students twice. Said, why do we have an old/retired policies? And they said, well, all of the ones that we found had that. And twice during the quarter, I pushed back and said, you need to take that out. We don't have any old retired policies. We never had any policies. We can't have old retired ones if we never had a policy. But they still argue that every policy, every policy set we find out there has it. And so we felt we have to include this. And since then, actually, I was just in San Francisco last weekend, and one of the young women who was on this team works at a bank in downtown San Francisco, and she came over to where the competition was happening, and we were chatting, and she says, by the way, I'm now sufficiently embarrassed about the fact that we included those old /retired policies. But I think it's something that is so easy to fall into, that you find some great policies from Sands Institute or from whatever source, and you just kind of copy and paste, and then you have a real satisfying 2-inch thick, bundle of policies. But I think that's a real failure, that policies need to be as succinct as possible to give specific guidance to how you should be operating. And so that was the main takeaways that I pulled from this. And I think the other takeaways that I came up with are, first, the idea of a master policy. I think that is an absolute requirement. Because I think you can't, there are a lot of things that I think people say, well, I didn't put that in the policy, it's just common sense. That should be covered. Well, some things common sense should be covered, it probably should be covered somewhere, but I think that's in a master policy where you say that good conduct concludes that we should do things in a certain way. We should have a certain amount of tech hygiene in our organization. And here's how we're going to define that. And so those common practices, best practices, I think that's great. I also believe, and we found in a small set of policies, we found where the business owner's actual need was written in the policy. Sometimes I think technical people go crazy writing policies, but they don't understand the negotiation that happened between the business owner and the client that was being done, and what promises were being made, and specifically what they should be being careful of. And so I think having that captured so that you have something from the business, here's what we expect of the system, here's what we promise our clients or our customers or whatever it might be. And then a master policy, I think, is a part of it. And then as succinct as possible, set of policies beyond that. And so that's something that I've taken on, in addition to other things that I'm working on, is trying to understand what a good policy looks like. So I have a team of students working on that this quarter. And I don't know if anybody else is working on that topic. Every conference I've gone to now in the last 6 months, I've been trying to throw it out there. This is something that we're working on. It's something that we don't feel we all have our hands around it yet, but we feel that we're learning a lot about it. And every time we talk about it, every time we hear other people talk about it, we add yet another item to our list of things that we think are important to include in this area. So if any of you happen to be interested in policies, I'd love to talk about that. To you about that. If you have good ideas on what a good policy should be, I'd be happy to hear about that as well. So, and that's all I had other than questions. And I think that's probably for Jim or I. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw them out here. Yeah.
Do any specific incidents come to mind when you think of these policies that are there that really have no business being there? Have they, any specific incident come to your mind where that caused a problem, having a policy there that didn't need to be there, or it was just a generally it just causes confusion?
I would bring up two of them, and Jim may have others. One of them for me is that even our policies now, our people in the data center don't read our own policy manual. I kind of really push them to read some parts of it, but I really can't blame them for not reading it, because there's a lot of bulk in there that makes no sense and doesn't even belong there. So it's in many ways a waste of their time to be looking at reading the policy. So I think that hurts us. I know from my work background, old policies hurt us very badly, because we had policies on things that didn't exist. We got audited, and the audit came through and says, your policy said you should be doing these things. Do you do them? Well, no, that's some old policy that we really don't pay attention to because it really doesn't apply to the system. And we failed our audit over that. And so, and that was, it had compliance issues tied to it. We did not get the compliance certification that we wanted. The company I was working with was in the supply chain for a big company that required all, certified supply chain all the way down. And so they missed on, and that was one of the important findings that they missed on, is there was a handful of things in their policies that they not only didn't do, they didn't even try to do. Because it was just dead weight left in their policy sets. But if you want to be PCI compliant, you can't have dead weight in your policies that you say you're going to do things and in fact you're not carrying those out or doing them. So I'm not sure if you have other ideas here, Jim.
I think that the same sort of idea, the one example I can think of is a research project I was involved in, and we had our first major security incident 2.5 years into the project. We wrote the incident response policy at the start of the project 2.5 years ago, and then we worked on a whole bunch of other policies and didn't think to go back and revise that incident response policy. So when we had to take it off the shelf, it had wrong contact information in it. It had titles of people who weren't in the project anymore, and so it really made it more difficult for us to respond. Whereas if we had a smaller set of policies that we were keeping up to date, and even doing tabletop exercises around to make sure that we understand how to go through the policies in the case of an incident, I think we would have been better prepared.
Yeah.
So in the organization, like you said, the policies, it bit you in the butt because it was outdated. Is there someone specific that should be updating the policy, or is that just something the team should be doing every month or every so often, that you go back at your policies and make sure everything's still good?
I'll take that from just our SBC, what we're doing. So far we've not assigned them out to anybody because right now they make no sense. But once they make sense, one of the things that we're going to have is every single policy in there is going to have an owner. And so we're going to do things like tabletop exercise. Our plan is that every policy has to have had a tabletop exercise at a minimum performed once a year. And so whoever that owner is, they need to understand, that's mine, I need to pull that out, I need to pull at least 3 or 4 people together, and we need to go through and do a little tabletop exercise of this. And if the number of policies is small enough, and if they're written succinctly, I think that's very doable. I don't think we'll end up, my guess is we're not gonna end up with more than 30 or 35 policies. We already have about 12 people that work in the data center. That means each person needs to take on 2 or 3, and then do a small exercise with it, with each one once per year. I think that's very doable, and I think that will help to avoid some of the problems that Jim just mentioned.
And I think in our template for the master information security policy, we recommend that it's the chief information security officer who owns that policy. Of course, it has to be approved by higher up, but then as ownership of other policies is delegated to other people, it's the information security officer's responsibility to make sure that those policies are being properly managed.
And I think that a lot of good, I call it IT good hygiene, but I think a lot of that comes from stopping just for a 20 or 30 minute tabletop exercise to think through a policy and think about things you're currently doing and realize, boy, we probably ought to do this differently. And I think sometimes we just don't stop to reflect. I think that any of those kinds of exercising those cause you to stop and reflect a little bit on practices. And I think sometimes the big egregious problems can be avoided with the little 20-minute exercise.
We found for projects that will have a weekly phone call for, we'll allocate part of one of the calls once per month for a tabletop exercise like that, just so we're keeping ideas fresh, either an incident response exercise or a risk assessment exercise.
Any others? Perfect. Well, thanks. And I'm sure Jim's the same way, but if you have any good information for us, please share. And if you have any questions, please ask.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.